I want to just ask you guys, what would you play for black? So let's take it in and see what's going on here. What should black do? If we're thinking endgame strategy, if we want to play like Capablanca and take it to the very end, where we can use those methods we talked about, what's the first move of the road to the endgame? Absolutely, bishop takes f3. Not just because it's an exchange, but also because it weakens the pawn structure. And it turns out that white lost the game for this sole fact alone. I'll just show you a couple moves. Black played a little bit actively, and this provoked some trades. And white didn't like that rook, so they played rook c1. Here's another trade. Now it's black to play and win. So I'd like that you guys to suggest a winning plan for black. Since it's a king and pawn endgame, if I was being really strict, I'd say you guys have to just calculate it to the end, because in king and pawn endgames, this is possible. But just a plan is good enough for now. What will black do? All right, 66 says king f6 looks great. Modasem says king d6. So which one is it actually? We have to think about why are we doing these things. So when I say plan, I don't mean just one move. But I also don't mean a variation. Like, what are we trying to accomplish? 66 pointed out that f3 and h2 are major weaknesses to press. So I guess the next thing is, do you think we can just win h2 and f3? Like, are we just going to go walk over and take them, or is there something else that we need to do here? Maybe as a second step, or is it something to do before that? What's the deal? By the way, this is a famous game. This is Cohn versus Rubinstein from, I guess, 1909. Sorry. I spoiled some things by using my scrolly thing. Yeah, it was 1909. Anyway, the move was king f6, but, like, what's the point? So Modasem says march the pawns up. Well, it seems that way because we only have pawns left that we have to march them. But there's a specific purpose, actually, and the order does matter. So we should start with king f6 because, like he said, h2 is the weakness. But it turns out we're not winning this h2 pawn. So why are we advancing the pawns? What's the point? What are we trying to accomplish? And you can think about those endgame principles again, right? Okay, we can pressure them with or without marching the pawns. And if so, which pawns are we marching and why? All right, so 66 said we made white's king useless. This is a good observation because one of the major things is we want to activate the king. So white can never activate the king ever again. So this is a good sign for the other side. So if they can't move their king at all, what we have to figure out is how can we improve our position even more. If we just push all the pawns in any way, it might actually end in a draw or even a loss. I tried this position against the computer a couple times, and I have to say I lost a couple times. I mean, that was a couple years ago, but still, it's possible. You can lose this position, even if their king can't move. All right, so there's a suggestion to march the G and F pawns. So why G and F? Like, why did you choose those? So weaknesses, he says. So it turns out that we should actually push every single one of the kingside pawns and just one of the queenside pawns. So starting with e5, they're going to uselessly move their king. The reason for b5 is that it fixes the weakness. This is another important endgame strategy. Whenever someone has a weakness, we try to make it so their weakness is immobile. Fixed targets are a lot easier to attack than moving targets. So b5, it makes the a3 pawn a sitting duck. But we don't have a majority on the queen side, so we're not trying to break through it. We're just fixing the weakness. And you might ask why, because the only piece that can attack the a3 pawn is the king, and this is actually the key. So we start pushing all the pawns. Notice how he's not pushing the a pawn at all. There's this thing called Steinitz's rule that says you should keep as many reserve tempi as possible. And a reserve tempo is a move which you can play with a pawn at any point in order to create a Zugzwang. So that's part of the endgame strategy. The reason we don't push all the pawns is so that we have more pawn moves in order to pass the turn if it's convenient to us. So he started pushing all these pawns. You might wonder why. Why is he pushing so many if we should be following this rule that we don't push many pawns? The reason is very concrete, actually. So these doubled pawns on the f-file, they give us an additional opportunity. If white just starts trading pawns, which is a typical endgame thing when people want to draw, they try to trade all the pawns. Black just keeps breaking through again and again. So they played e4, and it ends up being very similar. Here's the first breakthrough. So they're threatening to either take the pawn on h2 or play g2, and either way they're going to win the game. Yeah, 66 is right. We're going to trade and then bring the king across the board to take the a3 pawn. Curiously, this position without e-pawns would end in a draw after this. They resigned here. But after pawn takes g3, king takes g3, the idea is that their king is stuck on the edge of the board. Their king is as weak as possible. Our king is maximum strength. They play like this, we play like this. And because we have this extra pawn, we actually win. So that's how it goes. This is a good example of endgame strategy at work. It just directly leads to an endgame after a couple pieces get traded, and because of first one weakness and then another weakness, white loses the game. That's endgame strategy. He didn't really do like anything special in the opening. He just doubled the pawns. That's how it went down.